Now I'd like to welcome today's presenter. Dr. Parminder Raina is a professor in the Department of Health Research Evidence and Impact at McMaster University and scientific director of the McMaster Institute for Research on Aging. Dr. Raina specializes in the epidemiology of aging, with emphasis on developing the interdisciplinary field of geroscience to understand the process of aging from cell to society. He is the lead principal investigator of the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, one of the largest and most comprehensive studies of aging in the world. He currently serves on the advisory committee of the FP7 funded projects on health and aging network of cohorts in Europe and the United States, and for Sci4Age. In this webinar, Parminder will share best practices and strategies for writing successful grants. And now, here is Parminder.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Laura, for those kind words. And what I'm going to do here for the next 45 minutes or so is to just share some of the best practices or the good tips that one needs to consider when you're writing a grant for peer review agency. And my experience generally is with health agencies such as Canadian Institutes for Health Research. So some of my examples would be based on that. Before I begin, what I like to do is to acknowledge, because this is a topic which I have generated information from various sources, some from McMaster Faculty of Health Sciences Research Office. They have resources how to sort of share good tips for preparing a grant. And through that, Dr. Jerry Wright, who is a faculty member here at McMaster, I have used many of his ideas and thoughts in my presentation. Susan Jagla, who's at University of Toronto, she gave a presentation recently at a meeting in Harrison Springs in BC. I've used some ideas from her and obviously resources from CIHR. When you're thinking about writing a grant, there are several things one has to keep in mind. One is track record, what kind of expertise you bring to the table, and what is your trajectory of your career. For example, many of you are going to be new investigators and will be applying for a funding opportunity. In that case, what area you have developed your expertise, what your publication record has been, or what you're preparing to publication becomes really important. So track record, or the trajectory of the track record and demonstration of that becomes very important in these applications. Second issue that you want to consider right at the beginning before you spend a lot of time writing a grant is that, are you actually addressing an important problem where there is a specific gap in the knowledge? So you're actually putting a piece of information in that gap that moves the whole knowledge base forward. And idea that you propose has to be creative. That will answer key questions or question related to the problem. It has to be logical but realistic. And more you will hear that it has to have a direct impact on the patients or the populations, the citizens or the policymakers. So the knowledge translation piece becomes very important. And then, because especially if you're a new investigator, having a right team around you becomes very important to fill the gaps that you might have. So you want to demonstrate to the peer reviewers that you have assembled a good team. Not only that team actually provides expertise in some of the areas, but also provides support and mentorship to you to accomplish this project in its given timelines and within the funding that you have been given. Obviously, it has to be implemented in a supportive and appropriate environment, so therefore demonstrating that university is very supportive of that becomes important. And in most cases, if you have some preliminary data, that's something you want to demonstrate that you know something about this knowledge, the likelihood of success of this particular topic becomes easy to convince to the reviewers. And the last point I want to emphasize that there's no such application that is perfect. Every application that goes in for peer review has some limitation. And We want our application to be solid, but we also want to understand what our limitations are in that project and how we are addressing those limitations. And I'll come back to that a bit later. So before you begin any grant application, one of the things you want to do is to understand the process. If you don't understand the process, you don't understand the requirements of a particular funding agency, you might spend a lot of time and energy but not hit the key headlines that you need to hit. So pick the right agency for the topic area you are going after. For example, if you're going for a health type of research proposal, you wouldn't go to NSERC or Social Sciences Council. There you will actually focus on CIHR, because if you send it to the wrong agency, it probably will not get a very favorable review, or it might be returned back to you before it is sent to the peer committees. And I think as you're writing the application, understanding the process is that reviewers are not the same people who review your papers. Most of the time, these reviewers are from many different disciplines. They are actually trying to understand what you are telling them in that written document, and they are making a judgment based on that. So you have to understand the process, that the reviewers are going to be people who are from a wide variety of fields sitting around the table. There might be one person who might have a knowledge of your area that you're presenting. So methodological integrity of the project becomes really, really important. So for that reason, because you're targeting reviewers who are coming from diverse fields of research and expertise, you want to avoid jargon. And you want to use a style of introduction that is familiar to people. Generally, Scientific American style becomes important. You also want to understand that your application is one in a pile of many. So assume that it will get picked last or first. And the way you write your application becomes very important. Somebody who picks first your application to review, that means they haven't had the context within which they are looking. So in that case, your goal is to impress them that every other application is calibrated against your application. And if it is last, you want to make sure that it is easily understandable to the reviewer, because the reviewer might be tired by the time they get to your application. So you're actually trying to change their mind to get really, you want them to enjoy reading that particular grant, as well as and force the reviewer to recalibrate their thinking after they have read many other grants. And it's not easy to, it's not that difficult to find someone in your institution who has been in one of these panels. Try to get an insight from them. So it's not, don't be shy to connect someone and ask them if they have sat on this panel and try to get their perspective on it. It is some of the homework, especially for new investigators becomes important. Another thing that I haven't mentioned here, for many of you, you have opportunity to contact CIHR and your institution research office and ask them that before you write your first major grant for CIHR or any other agency, I know more from a CIHR perspective, is that you would like to go as an observer and observe how this process works. So you can go 2-3 days during when the applications are reviewed. You sit in a corner and you sort of understand the deliberations that go around the table. It is an invaluable tool to have, understand how decisions are made. And you should consult with your research office and see if your institution works with CIHR to do that kind of observership. And just to give you a sense of, using the example of CIHR, but many other agencies work the same way. Usually there is a chair who runs the panel. There's a scientific officer who actually summarizes the discussion that is happening, any discourse or agreements or disagreements that are going on. There are panel members. Usually it varies depending on the committee, but there could be as many as 12 to 15 panel members. Let's say if you have submitted an application, your application will be reviewed by two. There is a primary reviewer, there's a secondary reviewer, and generally there is a reader. So the primary reviewer first presents their assessment of the application. The secondary reviewer will come in and either confirm many of the things the primary reviewer has said, or disagree or agree with the primary reviewer or add new things that the primary reviewer didn't add. And then the reader actually gives their impression. And after that, a roundtable discussion ensues. So people discuss the application based on the summary of the primary and the secondary reviewer and some input from the reader. And based on that, consensus is achieved. And then the path, let's say if through that consensus it's said that the score should be 4.2. At that point in time, then the panel is asked to ballot in secret, and they can vote 0.5 plus a 0.5 minus. So somebody who's scored by consensus 4, their score by some panels could be as low as 3.5 or as high as 4.5. And that's what determines your score and fundability. And generally, you're ranked to the other applicants in the panel, so you're sort of compared and calibrated in comparison to other applications. So that's how the process actually works. And you also, when you're writing a grant, you want to keep in mind that there is a certain review criteria that funding agencies have, specifically CHR. Their criterion one is concept. That's 25% allocation score goes to that, significance and impact of the research. Second one is criterion 2, which is feasibility. That's where you spend a fair bit of time describing your approach and methods. So you want to be really solid on your methodological approach because that is 50% of the total score. And then 25% is left for expertise, experience, and other resources that you have in your so maybe I should clarify, the overall feasibility is 75, overall concept is 25, the 75 of the feasibility split into 50 and 25. So the feasibility overall is worth 75%, and then the 25% is left for knowledge translation and policy impact or engagement with patient population. Tip number 2 is know your audience, and in this case, your audience are your reviewers, and they're like your colleagues, too busy, and some of them are not experts in your field. Write for a grumpy reviewer who's very busy and is going to read your application the night before, or likely on the way when they're flying to Ottawa for the review panel, and they are trying to go through power read through these applications. Write for that type of a review. And also, understand how people like to read. They don't like to read complicated, convoluted things. So rule of thumb is you have one major hypothesis with 3 specific aims, and reviewers have, on average, 10 or more grants to read and assess, and likely 1 or 2 will get funded. So your job is to make it really clear and succinct, but exciting at the same time. And the first paragraph and a half, which is the rationale, you're actually making the elevator pitch. You're actually making the case for your grant. And you don't want your reviewer to wait till your objective or research question section or method section to figure out what the heck you're trying to do. Lay out your idea up front in the first paragraph so the reviewer knows what is coming down the line. So make your elevator pitch and link it to what you're proposing to study in this application. A well-crafted bulletproof story that speaks to the mandate of the panel will always do well. And you've got to keep that idea in mind. You do not want to write too many things, too many research questions, and don't want to make it a very ambitious hodgepodge of things that is not likely to get funded, even though it was a good idea, because people start to question how you're going to do this in a 3 to 4 year grant. So keep it simple, doable, and achievable. Tip number 3 is play by the rules. Don't try to fudge. Let's say you have 13 pages to write your application in, and each section has a certain number of characters or words that you have to put in. Don't play around with margin, fonts, and page numbers, and just follow the rules because, for example, if you're sending an application to NSERC, your research office will actually take a ruler and measure the margins and the size of the letter, and they will reject after you have done all that work. So make sure that you follow the rules. And also be mindful about agency you're sending your application to. What are the rules for salaries, travel, services, and what do they fund and don't fund? So you want to have that sense beforehand because that will help you craft your project more appropriately. And as a reviewer, when I'm around, when I'm reviewing proposals, the proposal, the application that is actually neatly put together with enough white space, gaps between paragraphs, actually becomes easier to review. So neatness counts. Use a font that is easy to read. Organize headings, do numbering of the pages, numbering of the headings. Don't put too many tables, or if you have to put a table, but only put it when it's absolutely necessary. Also, if you have published in the area you are trying to propose in this application, highlight papers from yourself or your research group within which you are working. And this is becoming more and more important. Be wary of the spell check. If you are sending it to a Canadian agency and all of a sudden you have an American spelling, you might annoy some of the reviewers and vice versa. Secondly, the issue that happens a lot is autocorrect. And if you're writing an application, you're trying to type in a decedent, and your autocorrection does descendants, it will change the meaning of your proposal. So be wary of this spell checks and autocorrection features of your software. And I cannot emphasize more the tip number 5. Make your proposal simple but elegant. Simple doesn't mean that you're actually putting forward a very boring, mundane question. Simple means that you have a very clear idea in your mind and you're writing it in the most simplistic way that anyone from any discipline with some level of scientific training can understand. But at the same time, it has to be elegant. And use figures to demystify jargon when you're writing your proposal. Outline a model, show preliminary data where possible. These are the things that make proposal very simple but elegant. And some people have tendency to put together very complicated figures to show very complex disease pathways. It is not a good idea. It generally confuses reviewers. Some people take 3 or 4 conceptual things and put in 3 or 4 figures and hoping that the reviewer will be able to figure out when they're doing multiple grants, and generally it does not go well. Keep it very simple, create a very simple figure, and that's how you want to present. And some of these things sound very administrative, and watch the resolution of your images, because a lot of us, even though we have it on our computer, still end up printing these things, and if you're printing, some of the figures don't come out clean. You can't read because resolution was not good, and so you're basically leaving the viewer in a bit of a handicap situation, and you don't want to do that. And keep legends of figures and whatever else you're putting very concise but entirely self-contained. You can't have a legend that somebody has to read the whole grant to figure out what that figure is saying. Figure has to be able to stand on its own. Presenting your CV, that's the tip number 6. It is really important because the scientific proposal is important, but you're also conveying to the reviewer that you are capable of doing this type of research. So presenting your CV becomes really critical. Emphasize your publications, number and quality. Be clear about any interruptions in your career because people have some very reasonable reasons to go away from their scientific career. Justify that. Be careful of the percent of allotment of time that you allocate to your grant. Sometimes people hold multiple grants and they say they are spending 30% on each grant and it adds up to 200% and usually not possible. And the reviewers will question how you're going to be able to give the time that this project is going to require. So be very careful about how you designate percent allotment of time to your project. Training is important to many peer reviewers, so you want to make sure that you have trainings indicated in your proposal. And not only from the perspective that the trainees are listed, you also want to show how they will actually add to the program of research in the project that you are proposing. Will there be some specific aspects of that project that will be done by the trainees? And many of you are probably familiar, all of our funding agencies, especially CIHR, use a common CV for generic information, and you have to select your 5 most important papers that you can attach to demonstrate that you have skills in this area and that you can convince the reviewers that you're going to be able to do it methodologically and from an organizational point of view as well. Tip number 7 is that really pay attention to budget, because budget isn't just there to describe that this is what it is going to cost to do this project. Many reviewers look at the budget and say, okay, this person has asked this budget. Is their budget sufficient to do the project they are proposing? And if there's a disconnect, people will think that you actually have no idea how to run this project. So the budget has to be realistic, and it has to connect back to what you are trying to propose in your proposal. And pay attention to justification of your budget. Justify every bit of dollar amount that you are putting in, why you need that particular person to do a particular experiment. So it becomes really critical that your budget is not under budgeted or over budgeted. It's just a right amount of budget that allows you to achieve the goals of your project. And do not inflate your travel budgets. Funding agency, you don't start asking that you need $5,000 in year 1 to go to a conference, because year 1 you're not going to even have the results to present your data at any conference. So be careful about that as well. As I mentioned earlier on, if you have students, justify how those students will contribute to your project, because you can ask for student stipends and so on and so forth, which you should, but make sure you justify. Tip number 8, which is appendices. A lot of people use this technique that they write the proposal, they write the main things, and then they have very thick appendices attached to your grant. Generally, what I like to see, and many people prefer, is that the application itself, the main body of the proposal, is standalone. Many reviewers will not spend and go through another 100 pages of appendices that you have attached. If you want to send a message to the reviewer that this is what you're doing, it should all be in the main body of the proposal. If somebody doesn't read the appendices, that should not leave them with a gap of understanding what you're trying to do. So appendices are, I generally recommend that you don't have very long appendices, only things like questionnaires and things like that can't fit in the main body of the proposal, or the data collection tools can go there so people can skim through. But generally, anything that is needed in the main body of the proposal should not be listed in the appendix. An appendix should be used to get letters of support. And when you're asking for letters of support, make sure you write the letter, first letter draft to the agency or the individual who's trying to sign that letter for you, so they know what you're looking for in that letter. It's not a bad idea to get a letter from your chair, dean, or director of your institute where you're located. And new faculty, it's even more important that be careful of competing with your previous mentors. Get a letter to show your independence. So you're actually bring them on your side as well. It's really critical. Another tip which I highly will recommend is that most institutions have internal peer review. Take advantage of that. Also ask someone outside of your field to read it. Sometimes it isn't a bad idea for your family member, spouse, or other colleague from other area of expertise to read it. If they can understand it, peer reviewers look at it. Also, especially your budget, send it to your institution, your research office to review. They're usually very helpful when it comes to how the budgets are crafted. And many of your institutions have grant writing links, such as from CIHR or any university, their research office will have used those to prepare your application. Now, those were many administrative, the things that you want to keep in mind. Now, the tip number 10, which I have here, is all about the research proposal. And it will vary a bit. Now, I'm using the guidelines of the CIHR here. Background and significance, you don't want to be going more than 2 pages. If you have preliminary data, link it back to each one of your research questions. Just don't leave it hanging in the middle. If you have a hypothesis or that specific things that you are proposing and the rationale linked to those, that should be done in half to 1 page. Then you start to spend time on your specific aims. What are you trying to achieve? Articulate the question clearly, provide some preliminary data, link back to those research question, discussion of your methodological approach, essential details. Don't sort of go into very minutiae detail. The details that matter in the sense that the reviewer can understand what you're trying to do. Always have in mind the particular approach that you're suggesting to study. What if that doesn't work? What is your alternative? What is your counterfactual in that sense? So think about alternate methods if your most favorite method actually didn't work out. And another where a lot of people mistake, they sometimes write grants and they will say, I will do objective 1. If the objective 1 is clear and it produces the result, that will result in me doing the objective 2. Be wary of that. You should never have a research questions or objective or aims dependent on the success of other aims. That is a case of that. So you don't want to do every objective research question should be able to stand on its own. Also, do not sort of rely too much on your collaborators saying that I'm going to do this project, but all of my work is going to be done in somebody else's laboratory or research group. That will not go well. And significance and timelines are critical, so you want to identify why this research is important and what are the milestones that you will be achieving through the life cycle of the application. And it's okay to be somewhat redundant in your application, re-emphasize things, but make sure you are not cutting and pasting the same sentences throughout the grant. Just vary it, but re-emphasize that. Redundancy sometimes is good, especially if you're articulating a complex method. I generally like to keep something I call PICO. Now, you can also call it PICOT, and that is that when you're crafting your research question, what you're saying, what is your population of interest? Whether you're studying an intervention or exposure, what is your exposure? What is your comparison group? What is your outcome? And the key part of the PICOT could be, what is the time frame within which you're trying to study? So a good question, especially in population research or epidemiological research or intervention research, clinical research, will have something related to the population. You want to tell the reviewer what population you're trying to study, what is your exposure or intervention. Very clear definition of intervention or exposure becomes really important. And what is your comparison group? And what are your specific outcomes? And you will spend time in your methodology to elaborate on each one of these elements of the PICOT. So here's an example of research question, and this is something you can frame it. The overall objective of project is to better understand the link between heterogeneity in major depressive disorder and biological and phenotypic aging among people over the age of 45. In this particular objective, you have given the population, you have given the age group that you're interested, you have given the exposure, and you have given the outcome. So you have actually given the pieces of the PICO. And then this is just overarching question. Within that, you can actually start to focus on specific aims and hypotheses. Aim 1 is here you start to elucidate more to tell a person what is your comparison group. We will assess the influence of major depressive disorder status, and in this case, major depressive disorder versus no major depressive disorder and inflammation and how it relates to some sort of an aging process. And then you can be even more specific and say, this is what your hypothesis is and this is what you're testing. So you're actually taking the reviewer through a thought process as you're sort of working through the overarching goal of the project, what the specific aim might be, and within that, what is your specific hypothesis you're like to pursue, and what are you expecting from your results. In my opinion, one of the most important part of which is the previous slide, is the crafting your question. It has to be very clear and concise. If your question is clear, approaches and methods actually become very simple, because if your question is convoluted and it's really messy, it is hard to write methods for that. So questions should be really clear and concise. Tip number 11, don't forget the summary page, because that is the very first thing the reviewer will read to gauge the novelty of the project, the excitement of the project, and so you want to spend some time. It is basically not a cut and paste of your main body of the proposal. This is actually another page you have at your disposal where you can actually make it sound very exciting for them. Make sure you got all signatures, and if you're doing laboratory research, you have gotten health and safety, and so on, ethics, and all the bit that is needed, or mention that you will be giving ethics if it is funded. Name all trainees in the grant if possible. Not all the time that are possible. If you have, it is better. Read letters of collaboration before you submit. Make sure that they are done in the right fashion. Check your math, sample size calculations. If you're doing, make sure you check and double check. Check your math in your budget. Check your math in relation to the timelines and how you're going to complete that project. These are details, but that's what actually differentiates a good detail-oriented application from a mediocre applications, because majority of the applications get rejected because people didn't pay enough attention to the detail. It's all about detail. You want to write an exciting application, but don't go overboard. Don't go into any sort of a hyperbole. Just you want to make it exciting, but not overstate. Also, don't use fancy words and try to create a soup of it from an alphabet. That generally doesn't go well. Keep a simple language. And I've already mentioned that don't rely on spell checks. Get someone else to give you your grant and look at the editorial part of your proposal. And it is always other strategy one should keep in mind, that you write a simple application. Once you have received the funding, you can go and do other things with that funding as well. So, and all those 12 aims that you might be interested, you can do once you have received the funding for your 1 or 2 aims. That's what the focus should be from your application craftsmanship point of view. And this particular slide actually highlights that the success rate for first-time applications is very low. So out of every 10 applications, one application will get funded. So don't be afraid of rejection. That is going to happen. It happens to all of us. In fact, when you will receive the peer reviewers' comment, you will get really irritated. You think, oh, they didn't get this or they didn't get. In fact, give it a time. When you think about them, generally it improves the grant substantially, and your likelihood of it getting funded also increases. And also pay not what the reviewer has written in their feedback, but also look at the scientific officer's comments, because that SO's comments summarize the discussion at the committee, and they will usually highlight 1, 2, or 3 major issues that actually resulted in proposal not getting funded, even though the individual reviewer's comment might be quite positive. So you will sometimes see that contradiction in comments, but SO's notes are actually gestalt of the total committee, discussion. So you want to pay particular attention to those notes. And avoid pointing out faults in reviewers. Always be gracious. Just say that you thought about their comments, where you could address, you address them, where you didn't agree with them. You don't have to roll over. You can actually provide your rationale why you disagree with the reviewer's comments in a very collegial, professional fashion. Don't be confrontational. That never goes well. Just take it that this is a professional peer review that was given to you, and you are taking those comments and revising your application. Agreeing and disagreeing is part of the science, and be respectful in that sense. It is absolutely okay to disagree, but in a respectful fashion. Go with your strengths, what you know. Don't try to please the reviewers if you don't even believe what you're writing. Go with your strengths. Don't try to just agree with the reviewer because they said so. And remember, you're going right back into a computation with some valuable feedback. But remember, you're a part of that pool again. You might get the same reviewers or you might not. So make sure that you're again writing your comments and everything in relation to your peer reviewers might be brand new set of people. And in time management, when you're putting together a grant, becomes really vital. Many people start writing grants 1 or 2 weeks before the deadline. The probability of that succeeding is extremely low. You will have to be a very lucky person to get funded. So give yourself at least 3 to 4 months ahead of the submission deadline to start writing the grant. That allows you to go for internal peer review at your institution. You can ask your colleagues to review it for you, and that's so critical. And don't try to sort of write your application all in one sitting. Try to work out through your specific page. Think about your study design. Write pieces and then bring it together. That's why you need extra time. Then make sure that all pieces are really integrated. They are connected. They are not just disconnected pieces of information, because many grants as a peer review when you see are not good, or because there is no link between different sections. They just show up in the middle of nowhere. So make sure that you make a plan and stick to it and integrate, revise, and re-revise your grant before the submission deadline comes. And when you're not feeling creative about writing the main proposal, work on your CV and budget, because those are, or you're writing a progress report or whatever else might be that needs to go, which doesn't require more creative but is more administrative stuff. And get your letters from collaborators as soon as possible. Don't wait till the last minute, because they might be traveling over the country and they can't get back to you. And I think this is one of the key messages in submitting an application. Some people will say that the written part of the application has to be really good. I think it's important that it's good, but you have to write well. It has to be understandable. It has to be good. And it is a skill that can be learned through practice. I think you should practice. Read widely, get ideas from people, how people write other things. Remember to construct paragraphs properly. Remember your audience. Avoid jargon. Make sure the big picture doesn't get lost in the detail. This is the biggest problem with new investigators, because they have finished their PhDs, they have defended their thesis, in their dissertations, they are actually going into a lot more minutia. This is not where you want to go in your writing grant. You're actually giving a big picture and providing methods that supports that big picture. So for example, if you're doing some regression analysis, you don't really need to go into a lot of detail and say how you're going to do the diagnostics of that regression analysis. You need to justify how you're going to do those analyses. People understand that you have that skill, or you have a statistician on your team who will know how to do that. And again, consult style guides, that's important. And my last statement for this presentation is that successful applications are coherent arguments of what should be done, not a list of what can be done. It has to be coherent. It has to read like a story. You're telling a story, and you want to convince the reader that this story is worth pursuing. Thank you. I'll just open it up for questions now. One of the questions that has come is that, can you give us some advice on forming the right team? What are reviewers looking for when it comes to career level of team members bringing together multiple institutions? So, as I said earlier on, if you have a team that you are trying to put together, that team has to be relevant to the proposed project. You just can't have people who are just there because they are senior or they have a good track record for research. So you want to make sure the team members you're bringing, they actually are going to be doing something related to your project. If you are a new investigator just starting out your career, it is not a bad idea to have somebody who's working in the area you have worked with and has a little bit more experience to bring them as a co-PI on the application. That allows you to demonstrate that you are going to lead this, but you have a backup plan who can provide the overall guidance in relation to this project. The question about multiple institutions, it is generally good, but to have people from different institutions involved. But again, it has to make sense from your collaborator's point of view, co-applicant's point of view, whether they are going to be contributing something specific to the proposal you are putting together. It doesn't really matter where they come from. Its relevant team for that project is much more critical. One of the things I will say is that if you are not ready to write your own independent grant, get involved with other people who are writing grants so you understand, working with a senior colleague, how grants get put together. That would be something that will serve you well in the long run. And again, I will say give time. Work and rework on your application. Question here is, how does CIHR view international collaboration specifically from UK, particularly if money is moving out of Canada? Now, generally, if I recall the open competition, which is the project funding, I don't think you can send money out of Canada unless something has changed recently. You can have international collaboration who actually can do something specific within the context of your project. And one place where I've done this previously, if there is something I cannot do in Canada that is only available in, let's say, in UK or Finland or Sweden, in that case, you can justify why you need those services and those collaborations from a colleague from outside Canada. In those cases, that justification becomes really important why you are doing. But generally, it's not easy to send money just carte blanche out of Canada if those projects or those methods and tools are available in Canada. But there are other types of grant competitions are there which require international collaborations. In those situations, the teams are allowed to exchange dollars and project ideas. Another question is for new investigators, when is the best time to write your first grant? And how important is preliminary data? This question is from Ottawa Hospital Research Institute. It's difficult to say what is the right time to write your first grant. I think you want to make sure that you have a good publication track record. There's no substitute for that. You can't put in a grant application where you only have 2 papers on your CV. You want to demonstrate that you have been productive. So that becomes critical. I would also recommend that you also want to demonstrate that you have been part of other grant applications where you have played an important role, CIHR grant application where you have played an important role as a team member. And having those on your CV actually helps your trajectory in relation to for your grant. I would say by the time you're an assistant professor in the first couple of years, you should be able to write your first independent grant because that's important from your tenure promotion point of view, and you should have a strong enough CV to demonstrate that you can do it. And the question of preliminary data, it varies a little bit by field to field. In basic sciences, preliminary data is absolutely critical. In epidemiological research, it is sometimes hard to get, but there you want to demonstrate that you have done something similar to the type of project you're doing from a methodological point of view through your publications. So that varies a little bit by the discipline you're focusing on. But in basic science, and even when you're doing clinical research such as clinical trials, having some pilot data becomes really important. Are there any opportunities for graduate students to apply for grants, maybe similar ones like seed grants? No, I think this is the only place where graduate students can apply for is your fellowship grants. You cannot apply, graduate students and postdoc fellows cannot go as PIs on grants to funding agencies for CIHR. And in fact, many of your own institutions won't allow that. Another question is, if there is no transfer of funds outside of Canada, is it value added to the grant to have an international collaborator? Is it better to try to find national collaborators? I think it depends on the project and what the international collaborator brings, and if you have a history of working with that international collaborator and how they will engage. So you will have to provide some level of justification why you want to bring that international collaboration. If that particular individual adds good value to your project and you have a history of working with them, then it's okay. But I think for a new investigator, probably I would recommend that if you can find a national collaborator with whom you have some track record, it's probably good to do that. Okay, it looks like there are no other questions here. And again, I want to say thanks to all of you for coming and joining and listening to this webinar. And I'm going to hand this over back to Laura Harrington. She has to say a few words.
Thank you, Parminder. Thanks very much for such a useful and informative presentation. I think people got a lot out of that and a lot of useful tips. Thanks to everyone who joined the presentation. As a reminder, we have recorded the presentation, so we will put it on our website at some point in the not too distant future. And we look forward very much to having the next conversation with you. Thanks so much.